Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. All right, I want to welcome our Evolving to Exceptional listeners back to another episode of the podcast. This week, we have another fantastic guest with us, Ryan. Ryan is coming to us from Ameren. He's the head of learning and leadership development, which is just a really critical, I think one of the most critical areas of focus right now in terms of people and performance and the needs that we have in the workplace today. And we know that the world is changing faster than it's ever changed before. And so learning and leadership development become that much more important. So we're going to spend some time unpacking that a little bit today. Ryan, I want to welcome you and give you a chance to maybe just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, why it is you do what you do, what makes you passionate about this area.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, for having me on. So I am actually a business psychologist is what I really think about when I think of myself. So I've got an undergraduate in psychology, and then I got my master's in IO psychology, and that's a lot of gobbledygook. I just like to talk business psychologist. And the way that I really think about it is we're taking those psychological concepts that we know about human beings, and we're taking them into the work world. And really, I'm using them to make the work and the organization better, but I'm also using it to make leaders better and to make teams better, and also just to make employees better. So how do we help organizations be even more successful, reach the goals that they want to reach, make sure that they're giving that value back to shareholders and the customers through people? Because people are one of our biggest resources. They're also one of our more complicated resources because human beings are very complicated. How do we really work through that? So that's really my goal, is when we think about whether it's team dynamics or organizational development, or even digging into just leadership development or people development in an organization. How do you drive that? So that's what I really love. That's why I get up in the morning. It's what I really enjoy doing every single day. I've worked in HR for about 20 years at a lot of different organizations, mainly here in the St. Louis area. I've done a little bit of a stint in tech where we're in a remote role for a while, but for the most part have been here in St. Louis, working from companies all the way to nonprofits, all the way up to global companies with multiple countries, with tens and thousands of employees, and kind of everything in between. So that's really who I am. It's what I love to do. I'm just unapologetically passionate about what I do here in learning and leadership development. I've done everything in HR. This is what I love. It's where I like to be. It's the place that I really enjoy the most.
I love that. And I totally agree with you. And I'm curious, what popped into my mind as you were describing all your different types of background and companies that you've worked for. Is there any, I know that each company says that they have their own unique set of challenges and problems and what they have to deal with. But I'm just curious if there's any common theme that you've seen as a challenge or something that comes up, and it almost doesn't matter how big or small you are, it's something that organizations struggle with.
Yeah. When you really think about that, and I think about what I do, every organization is a little bit different. Their culture is a little bit different. Whatever product they do or they put out there into the world, how they service the community, all a little bit different. Leadership is the same in every organization. I think people like to think of themselves very different. Like, oh, leadership here is just more complicated than leadership at a different organization. No, it's not. Leadership is leadership because you're leading people, and people are complicated, and we're human beings, and we make mistakes, and we strive to be the best leaders that we can, but sometimes we fall short. It's just the reality of it. So I don't think, no matter what organization I've been in, whether it's been a nonprofit all the way to a global company and everything in between, leadership's not different. So when you think about leadership, really making sure that you're developing and you're growing your leaders, you're spending time with them, you're helping them understand what good leadership looks like for that organization, that's hard. And I think all organizations, especially now, really struggle with their leaders and balancing this new world, because there was pre-COVID and post-COVID, as far as I'm concerned. Pre-COVID, a lot of scenarios where most leaders were really using command and control for a lot of what they were doing, no matter what type of organization you were looking like. Some of them better than others when it comes to that.
Right.
For the most part, we were really living there. we were starting to walk that line of talking more about human-centric leadership. I think once the pandemic happened, the world upended, and managers who maybe kept their mask on and were very specific about who they were and what they showed, some of that melted away. And so their team members saw more of who they were. They saw a more human version of who they were from a leadership perspective. People started looking at their own lives and the way that they are working. I'm like, do I have enough work-life balance? Is this what I really want to be doing? How do I think I should be treated at work if I am going to be spending all this time at work, more time than I probably am with my own family? So people started recalibrating for themselves what the work experience looked like. Leaders showed a different side to them. And so then post-pandemic, where we've got all these individuals going back to the office, now we've got a lot of hybrid. You've got Amazon out there saying everyone's coming back to the office 5 days a week. Leaders have been dealing with a lot of change, and just the work of being a leader has changed. It went from everybody being there in person for the most part, in a lot of companies, some not, switching to more of a hybrid model. Now we're switching again to a lot of people bringing individuals back into the office. So how to be a leader and what that looks like, and how you lead people from afar and together, and sometimes they're together, and from a hybrid perspective, and dealing with their emotions, being a more human-centric leader, man, we're putting a lot on managers these days. And
So,
yeah.
so it makes me wonder. So that is just popping in my head so strongly is when, what do you see? I agree with you. During the pandemic, we saw this shift happen and this vulnerability happen. And it's almost feels like maybe we've shifted back, or I'm just curious of your perspective on, has that continued forward, or is there also like a return as leaders to get back to that more comfortable, separate, not so vulnerable state that they used to be in before we went through that? I'm just curious of your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's swinging a little bit because we've seen what there was pre-pandemic. The pendulum swung pretty far, especially while people were I remember having the team that I did during the pandemic. I had a couple people that were really having some mental issues, really struggling with their mental health. So it swung. A lot of leaders were dealing with that, not only their own mental health that was going on during that time too. I think it's starting to swing back. What I think is interesting though is who and where and at what level is that swinging back? I think your day-to-day managers, I don't think that's shifting that much. I think they're trying to find the balance because you still have to hold people accountable and make sure that they're productive. But you also probably want to do that with empathy because they do have choices and they can go other places, and they will disengage from you pretty quickly because, again, they know that you can treat them like a human being now. So you can't get away with not treating them like a human. I think what's interesting is how are executives looking at this? And I get it. Executives are thinking about shareholders. They're thinking about the investments in these facilities that they've put out there. And what happens when I've got this whole thing full of a facility that's empty? On top of the fact that there seems to be this drive of, we were just more productive in person. Were we? I don't know. A lot of the data shows that we might have actually been more productive at home, or being more productive when we have a nice balance of that. I think where a lot of leaders are struggling is executive leaders, for the most part, where they're struggling is really looking at, okay, is collaboration really as good as it was beforehand? I don't know. I think some groups, some departments, some organizations maybe do struggle a little bit with collaboration. Does that mean you need to bring people back into the office 5 days a week to increase collaboration? Probably not. Some people are going pretty extreme. They're going to back, like you said, what did they know? What they knew is when they had everybody in the office. Now, what I think people will rebel against if this starts happening more and more, and we start pulling everybody back into the office 5 days a week, if we get back to the point of like managers and leaders just walking around and managing by walking around and micromanaging everybody and wondering what the heck was going on with everyone, just constantly in everybody's business, that's going to decrease productivity. That's going to decrease morale. That's going to decrease people being able to be innovative and creative and get the things done that they need to. Because a lot of what I heard from leaders even during the pandemic was, how do I know that they're getting work done at home?
Yeah.
And I always used to challenge them with, how do you know they were getting work done in the office?
Yeah.
I'm like, you're in meetings 75 out of the 76 hours of the day.
Yeah.
There, you weren't sitting with them in meetings. Like, how do you know that they weren't spent 3 hours a day on TMZ? Like, you
Yeah.
don't. You don't know that at all unless you're a micromanager and was all over the business. Were they getting the work done? Were they meeting the goals they were supposed to? Were they getting the outcomes that they were supposed to? And that doesn't necessarily mean someone's sitting in a seat for 8 hours and you can necessarily know that they were sitting in that seat for 8 hours, because it doesn't mean that they were working. Doesn't mean that they weren't on LinkedIn for 4 hours that day looking for a new job.
Yeah.
So, I
So
mean,
there's
leaders have to think differently.
yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple things I want to hit on that you said there. One, I want to hit on the productivity piece. And you talked about productivity versus outcomes impact. And we tend to fixate on productivity and increasing productivity and effectiveness and all of those things versus the results, versus what is the output or the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And so whether a person is able to sit at their desk for X number of hours and churn out X amount of work really doesn't matter if it doesn't turn into business results, if it doesn't turn into what you need it to from a business standpoint. You also talked about this focus on people and treating people like humans, which is everywhere right now. Every thought leader, everybody's talking about it. And I might be a little controversial when I say this, but I have yet to actually really see anyone hitting this out of the park and like really nailing it. Individuals are, but not whole organizations. And I'm curious from your perspective, what you're seeing and whether leaders today have the skill sets or have the development they need to really lead in that way, to really lead in a human centric way.
I think it's a huge change for people. And so my short answer to that is some do. However, they built those skills, who knows? But there are a lot of leaders out there that still struggle with this. Because when
Mhm.
we say being a human centric leader, what do we mean? It might mean having a little bit more emotional intelligence. Maybe some leaders did some really good research, maybe they did a self assessment, maybe they did a 360, maybe they figured out a little bit more about who they were. Maybe they did the work to understand what that looked like. Not every leader has. Not every leader feels like that's important. So whether it's something like understanding really from an emotional intelligence perspective, what do you look like? Whether it's really understanding what psychological safety is and as a leader, how do you build psychological safety? How do you do that for a team? That's another skill set that probably leaders need in this day and age. And I think about a lot of the great work that Brene Brown has done over the years around dare to lead, around the idea of being vulnerable, or as I like to say, appropriately vulnerable, because I've had a couple leaders in my day that were very vulnerable and maybe too vulnerable. Talk about TMI. I knew way more about their lives and the specifics of their lives than I ever wanted to know. So I think there's an appropriate vulnerableness that really we all want to potentially have too. So are most people feel comfortable being vulnerable? Some don't. Do most individuals feel like they understand what psychological safety is and how to build that in a team? Some leaders probably do it wonderfully just because they are who they are and that's how they lead. There's a lot of people that don't know how to do that because that's not why they became a leader. They became a
Mm.
leader because they were really great technically at their job, not because they were great at the job of being a leader. Yeah, just like you have to build leadership skills for individuals when they join and when they become leaders, there's a lot of people out there that are already leaders. Maybe have been leaders for 10, 15, 20, 30 years that don't have the skill set because that's not how they were taught to lead, or that's not what their culture supports as well. So there is a whole new skill set that individuals need and want. Then you have to balance this mental health piece about it, like we were talking about. Do I want my leaders talking to people about their mental health? Probably not. I want them to be sending those individuals along to the EAP. What I do want them to talk about is asking the questions, making sure that people are okay, making sure that showing that you care, showing empathy. Do I want you helping someone figure out their depression? No. We want them to go to the right person to be able to do that. And so I think it's really setting that up as an organization to understand and set those expectations for leaders too, because it's a new world. It has been.
Mhm.
It really is a new world now. So I think, are all leaders ready for that? No. I think, how do we help leaders really build the skills around human-centric leadership that they need.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I think as you're describing those different skill sets that maybe make up those more advanced leaders, or those leaders who are able to do it well, able to focus on that human being. I think what becomes really apparent to me is that they have spent time understanding themselves. So a deeper level of their own self-awareness, and also understanding the human being and how the human being works. And I think you mentioned Brene Brown, what a lot of her research has done has equipped leaders with a better understanding of the impact and the ways in which humans actually operate, how they actually respond to different situations. And as there's been this influx of greater emotional intelligence, more psychological safety, like those kind of key words, all actually relate back to the way that the human body and being works. And one of the things I talk about a lot is that as leaders, we're not really given that training. At least I wasn't. And I was certainly not in college, grad school, law school. That wasn't something we covered. Going throughout leadership, getting trained in multiple different areas, that wasn't something that came up. And what's interesting is I talk a lot about the neural networks in the human body, and that we have neural networks are neurons and that fire and send messages in our head brain. Everybody knows that. But we also have about 60,000 neurons in our heart. And we have neural networks more than that, like 100 million in our gut. And so our heart and our gut relate actually back to those kind of two elements of emotional intelligence, our feelings, how we connect and relate to other people and what's important to us. That's our heart. And then our gut, which is responsible for self-preservation and safety, our core identity, and then also mobilization, getting into action, which is why if we don't feel safe, we don't take action. We don't do what we need to do. We drag our feet, we procrastinate, we struggle. If we've got fears, if we're afraid we're going to fail, all those things limit our ability to show up and perform at our best. And all of those, as I've worked with some executive leaders and folks, they're like, how come nobody told me this? And it's interesting because even when we train on emotional intelligence or psychological safety, and I don't want this to be a blanket statement because everybody's training is different, but a lot of times we train it from the head still. The what is it, the information, the steps, the process, the clinical nature, and not necessarily from like an embodied, what does this feel like perspective, or really experiencing and doing it perspective. So I'm curious, we teed it up right at the end there. How do we do this? How do we, develop leaders, but really everybody, because we need more people to have these skill sets at all levels, not just the executives, but all throughout the organization. How do we develop this or embed this?
I think two ways to really think about this. One, do people even really understand emotions? I don't know that a lot of people really understand emotions. If you give people pictures of emotions and have them interpret what those emotions are, there is a wide variety of how good people are at that. We are not as good at that as we think we are as human beings. And so if you've got leaders that don't have that emotional intelligence, but also just can't recognize emotions, because that's only part of emotional intelligence. But if they can't recognize them, if they can't recognize them in the first place, how are they supposed to go, oh, maybe I should ask that person a question. Maybe I should dig in deeper. Maybe I should stop and find out what's going on with that person and ask them why they seem a little bit off today. Like, they have to recognize emotions in the first place. And you got to think about the type of people, like I've worked with engineers and scientists and lawyers, and those people, some of them great at recognizing emotions, a lot of them not their strong suit.
Yeah.
Not their strong suit.
Uh-huh.
So how do we help people, especially for people that are more probably analytical, really understand things like basics? Do you understand and get emotions? We are doing what's called a targeted skill building series here at the organization I work at right now. And we've just kicked it off. We've got some great numbers of people that are signing up. We've got a session coming up about presentation skills coming up, because that's a question and a topic we get a lot. Got like almost 200 people signed up for it. But in the second half of our roadmap for early next year, we do have a whole session that we would like to teach about emotions. And what does it mean? And what are they? And what they look like? And how do you recognize them? So one, I think, as goofy as that sounds, like, oh, we know what emotions are. We're adults. No, we don't. Most people don't. They don't really understand exactly what emotions are. They can't put words to an emotion. And if you can't put words to an emotion, if you can't put behaviors to an emotion, how are you supposed to get better at it? And how are you supposed to recognize it? So one, emotions, I think, is the first place. You've got to start getting people a little bit more educated and a little bit more thoughtful around that. I think that's a place we have to start with people.
So let's unpack that a little bit and then we'll get to your second one.
Sure.
I think you've got another one. But I think I was laughing a little bit because I'm an attorney. I went to law school and I'm married to a mechanical engineer and I worked in the engineering sector for many years. My dad's an engineer, my mom's an accountant. So I'm laughing because I relate, right, so deeply to the what are emotions. And even myself, for many years, the way to deal with emotions was to put them away, was to box them up, put them to the side. We don't need to deal with it. It doesn't belong in the workplace. We don't have space for that. And all that since then I've discovered catches up to you, impacts your health, impacts your ability to relate to other people, impacts how you communicate, impacts how well you make decisions. And one of the things I think that's interesting is that oftentimes with emotions, people don't know how to label them. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But also, they don't even necessarily know what they feel like. And what I mean by that is when our heart is communicating emotion and feelings and what's coming, it's often in other ways, like sensations or smells or tension. Same thing with our gut when our gut's communicating. It's not the same that stories that our brain is constantly telling us. Like we can listen to our brain really easily all the time. It's got language. And so when it comes to understanding emotion, it requires us to slow down and to stop and to sit with it and to have space for it to come up. And in our cultures, we don't make a lot of time for that, to just stop and say, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? What might they be feeling? Why might they be feeling that way? And so it's actually not complicated, but if your patterns that you've built throughout your life are, I'm not doing that, then it's easy to dismiss. Now, the thing that I think is interesting and a lot of people will say is, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter that we gain this awareness, or why can't we just tell people to deal with it on their own, etc.? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think this actually gets into my second point. It's
Okay,
actually
great.
perfect. It's a perfect transition to my second point. So you asked, what do we need to help people understand this? It's a little bit more, emotions are not only what's the label, but what are you feeling and how does it impacting you? So a lot of times I'm a social and emotional intelligence coach too. So I've got that certification on top of it. And I do a lot of coaching for individuals on that topic within my organization. And so often one of the things that you really see when someone is self-rating themselves on emotional intelligence is this kind of lack of emotional restraint. It's one of the things, but there's many types of things, of course, that can show up in your emotional intelligence kind of report. But that's one that I get a lot with people. And really where I start with them, Jessica, is say, okay, so let's think about this for a second. So one, do you really truly see this as an issue? Tell me about a couple scenarios where this has showed up at home or at work. And people can usually give me those scenarios pretty quickly. But then I ask them next, what are your triggers? And they're like, oh. And I hear lots of reasons, like sometimes it's being challenged, might be a trigger for someone. Sometimes if somebody thinks they're not being listened to or they're being disrespected, that's a trigger for them. There could be a multitude of reasons why someone, then we go into trying to uncover what are those things that trigger you? Like I'll share one of mine. One of mine is, again, I'm really passionate. I love to get things done, really important for me. Sometimes I get really too close to something I'm working on. And one of my ex-team members really told me this. She goes, we feel like it's a baby bunny of yours. And then you can't tell somebody that their baby bunny is ugly or that it's not a cute baby bunny or that it has 3 ears instead of 2.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, oh, and she goes, so we just need to know sometimes, is this a baby bunny for you or is it not? And they got to the point of asking me that, Ryan, is this a baby bunny for you? Do we need to do this or do we have some flexibility here? I'm like, oh, it's not a baby bunny at all. And they'd be like, okay, perfect. We just needed to know, is this a baby bunny for you or not? But when we understand what triggers us, that's only part of it. So I like to go to the next level that you're talking about, Jessica. So if I've got somebody, I'm giving them this coaching, we figured out what their triggers are, I go, what happens when you're triggered? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, what physically happens to you when you're triggered? What happens to your body?
Yeah,
And
beautiful.
they go, oh, I'm like, your ears get warm, your heart start beating really fast, your blood pressure up, is your stomach cramping? Because these are the physical manifestations of you reacting to the thing that triggers you, or sometimes for people receiving feedback, especially if it's receiving feedback from somebody that they don't particularly like or respect. So I also talk about that a little bit with receiving feedback and what that can look like and feel for a person. Because if you can understand what those things are, if you know what your physical manifestations of your triggers are, can you control or slow those down a little bit? Like you said, Jessica, how do you slow down the beating of the heart? Or how can you slow down when you just start getting red from the neck up? Because you can just feel the fire burning right up from probably from your gut, also maybe a little bit from your heart. You can just feel it coming up. One, recognizing what happens to us when we get in that scenario. And then what are the things that we can do, whether it's stopping for 10 seconds, whether it's maybe excusing ourselves if that's the scenario and situation that we need to be in, if we know that's bad enough. Whatever that is, those little ways that we can stop and breathing for a moment or two before you react or respond to something. Just making sure that people think through some of those things before they're doing that. So that to me is helping leaders and helping people understand that aspect of it too, is that you have to know what are those things that kind of set you off or trigger you. What is your physical body reaction to those things? And what can you do to minimize that physical reaction so that it's not as severe and that maybe you don't say or do something that you really are going to regret later?
That is so interesting. And when it makes me, and absolutely brilliant in terms of coaching and the support. And I think it's great that you brought up the value that brings for people and how much just a little bit of coaching can unearth a lot of those triggers or challenges or things that people may not be conscious and aware of. And I often say that when we evolve and grow and when we really develop as humans is really in connection and partnership with another human. That very rarely do we sit at a desk with our notebook, watching something on our own and somehow get transformed or evolve our way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. It is usually in connection or relationship with other human beings. And so I think it's really powerful. And I think the challenge, that comes to mind is that most people aren't trained in that, right? You have that really a brilliant skill set, and most certainly the broad population isn't. Leaders, by and large, it's still probably a subset that are really trained in how to do that or guide someone. And so then the question becomes, how do we develop people to be able to do that with one another? How do we develop our leaders to be able to be that person, be that performance partner, be that person to their people? And how do we do that pretty quickly? Because we don't have decades to figure this out. We gotta figure out how we do this differently like yesterday. And I say that a little tongue in cheek because mental health issues have been on the rise. There's been lots of conflict and challenges. We know that we've got some social political instability happening, certainly. And so if we can't navigate this better, it's gonna manifest. It's gonna impact business. It's gonna impact people.
It is, and it already is, and it will continue to impact people. I think we have to set expectations of what leadership looks like now. So
Mm,
even if you had a great expectation set of what leadership like and what it was pre-pandemic, it almost doesn't really matter. It's probably
Yeah.
changed. It probably looks different. It probably, maybe at least it needs to be refreshed as far as what that looks like. I don't know that most organizations do a really good job of really talking about what leadership is. Like they might have competencies, or they might have a leadership model and a whole bunch of other leadership artifacts is what I like to call them. But do they truly let people understand what being a good leader looks like, what being a good leader feels like, and what it really means to be a good leader, not just what the competencies on paper tell us? Like, those are important. Those are helpful. They really are. I think anything that really is a leadership artifact that helps people understand what that looks like is helpful. But those leadership models from 5, 6, 7 years ago, do they still pertain to what leadership looks like today? It's changed and shifted and adjusted so much in the last 4 or 5 years. If you haven't looked at your leadership model, that's the first place I would tell people to start. You've got leadership artifacts. Have you looked at them lately? Do they still mean something? Do they still make sense? Even at Ameren, and we've got more work to do in this area. We do not have this all figured out by any means, but we like refreshed our competencies like in the last year or two. And one of the things that we added, which we never had before, was a competency called engage respectfully.
Mm.
And that's for individual contributors all the way up to executives in the organization. And if you ask me, what we could have called that competency was just human-centered leadership. And
Yeah.
we might as well have just called it human-centered leadership. Now, it probably wouldn't have landed well in the organization if we did that, but that's the reality. Like when I look at that competency, I see that as human-centered leadership. I was talking to the CEO the other day. We were talking about how he uses the language around this in helping people in the organization. His tagline's a little bit more of don't be a jerk, get things done safely, don't be a jerk. And I'm like, I love that, but let's take it down a level. I've also heard you talk about emotional intelligence and the importance of
Yeah.
that as a leader. That's what I really want to hear you say more to leaders. I was lucky to get 5-10 minutes with him in the lobby, talking to a couple other people and just, okay, let's see if I can help him shift his language just a little bit and start talking about some of these things just a little bit more. And so you have to set that expectation and then you have to help train people to do it. So one of the ways we're trying to do that at my current organization is we launched a new program called Elevate in May, which is training for newly promoted or newly hired from the outside leaders into the organization. So that first and second level leader, which would be like a supervisor or manager, like how do we
Mm-hmm.
help those individuals out? So we have a 7-hour training called Leading the Ameren Way, which is what we're trying to do is, again, set the expectations of what it really means to look like to be a good leader at Ameren and what that looks like and what are the expectations. We dig into a lot of this. We dig into a lot of about emotional intelligence and giving and receiving feedback and the importance of a good one-on-one, not a one-on-one where you just talk about technical stuff and you go through your little checklist, but like a true one-on-one where you're connecting in with the person, you're making sure that you're okay. Yes, you're finding out if the work's getting done too. That's part of it. But all these other aspects of it, a good one-on-one can look so different. Having good performance conversations, having good coaching conversations. Like that's part of what we're talking about there because we want people to know and understand that all of that is important to be a good leader. It's not just that you're a great lineman. It's not just that you're a great engineer. It's not just that you are a great accountant, but we need you to be a good leader because a leader is a different role. And whether you know it or not, you just took on a very different role.
So I'm curious, when you say that, how do you accomplish that in a way that creates lasting change? Because telling people what they should do and need to do and setting the expectation is foundational, critical, right?
Yep.
But we have almost infinite access to information today. Not almost, we do, right? You can find out information on anything you want in almost virtually instantly. I can ask ChatGPT anything I want and it'll find it out there for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing about it is one thing, developing it, embodying it, doing it consistently. And I always like to say, not just doing it, but doing it until it's part of your way of being, till it's become like riding a bike, like driving a car. You don't have to think about it. And that's one of the gaps I've seen a lot is that leaders do it for a while or sometimes, but not usually enough for it to get into those neural networks where it becomes part of their ways of being. So I'm just curious how you're going about that. It doesn't mean you've got it solved, but what are you guys trying to do, or how do you see ways to make that effective?
Yeah, I think one is the way that we're doing Leading the Ameren Way. So it is an in-person course. We actually require people to come in. And I know everybody has different feelings about all of that right now. We're at an organization where we can do that. We're not a global organization. Doesn't mean flying people in from all over the country. You can come from Indiana, Illinois, mostly Illinois, Missouri. You can come in for this training. We think it's worth it. So that is the one session we really require. One of the main sessions that we really require for part of Elevate is you're going to come in for this. And yes, we espouse information also in a very entertaining and educating where people like actually catch on to it.
Yeah.
But it's a workshop if you really want to think about it. It's
Yeah.
a lot of like practice. It's a lot of learning from each other. So I think post that, how do we continue to help with that? One, a lot of follow-up.
Hmm.
Two, how do you really make sure that you're building a community of practice amongst the people that are there so that they can go and reach out to these people that they went to this class with and say, hey, I had a really hard conversation coming up and I'm a little scared. Can you like work through this with me?
Yeah. And I think to your point, there's a lot of when you bring people together, there's a lot of insight and wisdom that can happen in those settings in the workshopping. But then how do you integrate that, right? How do you integrate that for folks so that so they keep up with it?
I think a big one too is you have to let the leader know what's going on in programs. One of the things that unfortunately I think happens with a lot of leadership programs is the leader knows their person's going. It's about it. So if you're not involving the leader in the leadership program so that they're aware of what's going on and giving them some guidance along the way of maybe some of the things that they should be talking to that person about, the leader can obviously help put the person in situations and scenarios where they can work on and use the skill in that 70 way that we always talk about, the whole 70-20-10. You got to use it. You got to go back and use it. You don't use it, you lose it. We know that with training. And so part of this too is how are you involving the leader in these programs? How are you keeping them up to speed? How are you maybe even giving them some guidance around topics and areas to have conversations around so that they can share their own experiences or just learn what that person might need from a development perspective? So I think that's part of this too, is that a lot of times leaders are off the hook with these programs. And if leaders are off the hook, or if they're looking at it from a distance and they don't really have a part in it, that's a problem.
Mm, yeah. So how do you keep them engaged?
One, I think keeping communication with them. So some of the programs that we've got right now, what we've started doing is doing like either bi-monthly or quarterly newsletters. So they know exactly what the heck is going on in the program. And in both of those scenarios, we've got a couple different programs. We actually are telling them what's going on. Like we not only are telling them what's going on, we're saying, hey, here is 4 topics that you should probably be talking to your people about. This is what they've been learning. We'll even give them questions to ask so that they can start digging into some of those things and encouraging again, how are you going to translate this into an experience within their environment where they can actually go back and use this? I think a lot of times when we do have programs like this too, is giving them a chance to go do it, then come back and talk about what worked, what didn't, what did you struggle with now when you did start going back and giving people feedback or really thinking about the way that you receive feedback or coaching somebody. So I think also setting up the way you're training people in a way that is, okay, maybe giving them the information and you're giving them some tools. Now give them time to go use it,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that we are expecting that you're going to go and use it. And now let's come back and talk about what worked, what didn't, what got in your way, what did you need to do? What do you feel like worked, but maybe could have been better? Really helping people understand how they can build that skill set. If it's not a one and done scenario and situation, again, people have to use it. The more that they use it, the more that they're knowledgeable, the more that they have to do it or potentially teach each other, they're going to learn it better than just, hey, I learned something in class. Now I got busy again. What did we learn about on Monday? Because it's Friday and I don't remember.
Yeah, so I want to ask one more question. This is you were talking about this program and your first level leaders. I wanted to also ask at the highest levels of leadership, because I think, and this is something I've heard from a number of HR leaders, they would never say it directly, but that's a big struggle, is to get the CEOs or the top executives or the most senior leaders the support or the development to keep them growing, and for them to be willing to maybe relearn some things that they thought they knew how to do, but now we actually know there's a better way.
You're an executive coach. I think we know when it comes to someone that's at that level in an organization, there is something to having some humbleness. And
Mm,
there is something to having the comfort level to having people around you that are going to tell you when you're not doing things. And one, not only that you're going to have people around that will do that, but two, that you're going to listen to it.
mm,
I think that's the part of it. That's the challenge that we get as we become, executives and we move higher and higher up as an organization is you've got more visibility. Everything you do impacts people. Everything can send a huge ripple through the organization. Just one word around. I was at a session with Filament. I don't know if you're familiar with Filament here in St. Louis, but great organization run by Matt Homan. And we were doing a training out there with some of our directors and senior directors this week. And one of the things that he had talked about was that one of our previous CEOs had just flippantly said something about Play-Doh at one point or another, just something about Play-Doh. And so the way that someone took that is that he didn't like Play-Doh. And so literally there was someone, and if you've been at Filament, there's a lot of things around, a lot of things that stimulate you, and it's a very different environment than a professional environment purposely. And so he was saying many years ago, someone who worked for that CEO was running around getting all of the Play-Doh and hiding it and putting it somewhere so that we didn't have Play-Doh in the room when we were working at Filament. And he didn't mean that at all. In fact, the person, Matt, said he put all that Play-Doh back out before the session started. Who was the person playing with the Play-Doh while they were having the session? Our old CEO. It's that aspect, this whole idea of once you're at that level, it's hard because I think our ego gets in the place a little bit once you're that high up on the food chain. But
yeah.
you've got to be able to get feedback from others. You've got to have that council of dissenters that will tell you when you're being an idiot, that will tell you when you're making a bad decision, that will tell you when you're treating people wrong, that will tell you when you're out of touch.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have to have that. Now, whether that's through internally, because I think you need it internally, but I also think things like, I think that's why a lot of organizations lean into executive coaching because they want that person that will be that kind of voice of reason or help them be thoughtful and be self-reflective. Now, the challenge is, does the executive want to be thoughtful and want
Mm,
to be self-reflective? And do they see it as a challenge or not? And that's a challenge for any leader at any level. So it's not like it's just an executive thing. I think it's exacerbated by the fact that you are an executive and that you have so many eyes on you and that you feel like you need to be perfect. Because if you aren't perfect, what's going to happen? But
mm,
I think what most executives need to know and understand is that they don't want their executive to be perfect. Do they want them to be great when they're talking to the investors on their investor call every quarter? Yes. We want that. We want that CEO to kick butt. When they're in a room of 25-year-old leaders, the leaders want to see that they're a human being.
yeah. And I'm going to give you a second in a minute, a chance to give any final thoughts, but I want to respond to that in that I think you were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that reinventing of leadership and rethinking what we mean by leadership and the model and what that looks like and what those needs are today. And I think this development conversation goes right along with it. That in the future of leadership or in the leadership we need today, we need leaders who are getting coached, who are focused on their development. That is just part of being an executive or a good leader, is to be receiving those things, and not that it's optional, right? Not that it's only if there's a problem or only if you need more self-awareness. There's not a person out there who doesn't need more self-awareness. I don't care how aware you are. In fact, the more aware you get, I think the more you're like, yeah, I need more coaching. Hey, this triggered me this week. Like, I need somebody to work with me on it. So I think that's a really critical piece. This has been just a fascinating conversation. I think I could talk to you for days on on these topics because I just love it so much. But I want to give you a chance to give any like final thoughts or words of wisdom to our audience before we wrap up.
Oh gosh. I think every time that as a leader, just be a human. Just be a human-centric leader. Think about your people as people. Try to find that balance. It's not easy. Yes, we need to hold our people accountable. Yes, we need to make sure that they're doing the work that they need to be doing. But we also need to make sure that we're showing up with this kind of appropriate level of vulnerability, that we are treating people as human beings, that we have some emotional intelligence, that we're building the right environment for them to be successful. Because really, that's what it's about, isn't it? To be a leader, you want your team to hit their goals. You want their team to be successful. You want the organization to be successful. You want to make sure that the shareholders are happy. You want to make sure that the customers are happy. That happens when people do their jobs really well. And to do your jobs really well, you have to make sure that you understand what that is, that you're on a team that's supportive, that you're in an environment that's supportive, and you've got a leader that's really helping and thinking so that you can be as successful as you possibly can. Like, leaders have a huge job. And if you're a good leader, you will send a ripple through the organization. If you're a bad leader, you will still send a ripple through the organization. So you're going to be sending a ripple no matter what. So decide which ripple you want to send.
So powerful and so important to remember moving forward. And for every leader out there that is listening to this episode, I think it's a great reminder that we have to keep focusing on our own development, that what we're doing is going to impact everybody, either for the better or for the worse, like you said. And certainly we want it to be for the better. We want it to be to create the outcomes, the world, the business results, the wise decision making, and the better impacts that we can have if we do that well. So thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on today. To all of our listeners, I just want to say thank you for listening. Just remember to always keep evolving, keep growing, keep rewiring those neural pathways so that you can live your best life, an exceptional life. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will be back again next week with another episode.